How do the smartest people win? They don't speak first. They don't argue. They don't try to prove themselves. They don't play for the crowd. They simply sit back, watch everything, and wait. And when the moment comes, they move quietly and win without a word. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this better than almost anyone, because he wasn't interested in popularity. He wasn't interested in being accepted. He wasn't even interested in being understood. He was interested in power, but not the kind that screams, not the kind that demands attention. Nietzsche wanted the kind of power that moves unseen, the kind that bends reality without raising its voice. And he knew the truth. Words are noise. Silence is leverage. We live in a world obsessed with noise. Talk more, post more, defend yourself, make yourself heard. Everyone is broadcasting, but almost no one is thinking. That's where the smart people separate themselves. They don't move like the rest. They don't rush to speak. They don't explain. They don't chase reactions. They understand something Nietzsche saw with clarity. Every time you speak, you reveal yourself. And the more you reveal, the less power you hold. Let that sink in. Because in a world where people overshare, overreact, and overexpose, the one who says nothing becomes the most dangerous person in the room. Nietzsche believed that real intelligence was not about speaking better. It was about knowing when to stay silent. Because silence does something words can't. It makes people uncertain. It makes them project. It makes them doubt. And in that space, you control the frame. Not because you forced them to see you a certain way, but because you gave them nothing to attack. That's the genius. You don't give them your plan. You don't give them your weakness. You don't even give them your presence. You just sit there, calm, focused, unreadable. And they begin to talk more, to justify, to overshare, to reveal. That's how the smartest people win, by letting others unravel themselves. Nietzsche said, "Those who know they are profound strive for clarity. Those who would like to seem profound strive for obscurity." In other words, the truly intelligent don't need to be mysterious. They are clear. They are silent. Because they understand that mystery isn't something you create. It's something you protect. And that protection, it begins with saying less. Look at how most people lose power. They argue with people who don't deserve answers. They try to explain their intentions to people who've already made up their minds. They react emotionally when silence would have said more. All of it, leakage. All of it, surrendering leverage. All of it, weakness disguised as communication. But the smart ones, they play a different game. They understand that silence is not passive, it's strategy. Because here's what happens when you say nothing. People start to guess. People start to assume. People start to overthink. And in that space, they give you more than you ever gave them. They try to interpret your silence. They try to guess your emotions. They try to predict your moves. And every time they guess wrong, you win, without lifting a finger. This is the essence of Nietzsche's power, the ability to see the game and refuse to play it on anyone else's terms. Let's get real. If you speak out of emotion, you're not in control. If you explain to be understood, you're already losing. If you need people to get your point, you've already handed over the power you were supposed to keep. Because the truth is, you don't need to be understood. You need to be effective. And effectiveness doesn't come from shouting. It doesn't come from being liked. It comes from knowing exactly what to withhold and when. Nietzsche lived this. He wasn't well liked in his time. He was misunderstood, rejected, often isolated. But he knew something most people didn't, that the truth doesn't need an audience. It only needs a spine. And that's the lesson most people miss. They think being heard is the goal. They think being seen is the prize. They think being loud makes them strong. But Nietzsche would say the opposite. He'd say, your real power begins the moment you become okay with being silent. The moment you stop broadcasting your every thought. The moment you stop chasing the approval of people who don't even understand themselves. Because when you can sit in silence, when you can walk away without defending yourself, when you can watch someone insult you and feel nothing, you've already won. And the reason is simple. Control over others begins with control over yourself. And silence is the ultimate expression of that control. But here's the twist. Silence isn't just about not speaking. It's about creating psychological space. When you don't respond to provocation, you signal strength. When you don't react emotionally, you reveal stability. When you don't explain your every move, you generate unpredictability. And unpredictability? That's how the smartest people dominate, without a word. Because when people can't predict you, they can't prepare for you. They can't manipulate you. They can't control the frame. They start adjusting to you, watching you, reacting to you. And that's when you know you've shifted from follower to force. Not through charisma, not through charm, not through persuasion, but through presence, sharpened by silence. And that's what we'll break down in the next part. The moment where silence becomes your most powerful weapon, and how to use it to shift any room, every conversation, and even your own identity, without saying a word. Because they've mastered the one skill most people avoid: emotional control. Not just self-control, not just discipline, but complete, internal, unshakable command over what they reveal and when. And here's what most people don't realize. Every word you speak is a window. Every reaction is a confession. Every emotional outburst is a message. I'm not in control, you are. Friedrich Nietzsche didn't believe in playing fair. He believed in playing real. And real power, to him, wasn't about dominance. It was about restraint. He saw what most people can't, that your silence speaks louder than your defense, that your lack of reaction is more terrifying than your anger, that when you stop responding, people begin to reveal who they really are and what you truly mean to them. Because here's the truth. People will test you, not always consciously, but emotionally. They'll push to see where your limits are. They'll provoke to see where you flinch. They'll watch how easily they can throw you off your center. And when they find out they can, they lose respect. Not because they're evil, but because that's how human nature works. We respect stillness because it's rare. We respect silence because it suggests mastery. We respect those who don't flinch because we know how hard it is not to. Nietzsche didn't talk about silence as submission. He talked about it as a form of transcendence. He believed the person who can withhold their words, their reactions, and their need to be understood is operating at a higher level of human consciousness. Because once you need nothing from anyone, You become impossible to manipulate. That's the secret the smartest people protect. They're not detached because they're cold. They're detached because they've outgrown the need to convince anyone of anything. They let others fill the air. They let the insecure speak first. They let the arrogant try to impress. They let the loud reveal their weakness. And in that silence, they learn everything. Because here's how power actually works. The person who speaks less sees more. The person who reacts less controls more. The person who explains less intimidates more. And all of that power comes from one place: emotional stillness. Nietzsche once wrote, "He who cannot put his thoughts on ice should not enter into the heat of dispute." Meaning, if you can't cool yourself down, you don't belong in high-stakes situations. Because power isn't about winning every battle, it's about knowing which battles are beneath you. That's where the average person fails. They fight every insult. They respond to every comment. They try to correct every misunderstanding. But in doing so, they drain themselves and reveal themselves. Because silence is uncomfortable. And most people would rather speak quickly than sit in the awkward tension of being unreadable. But the smart ones, they've made peace with that discomfort. They've trained themselves to sit in it calmly. And while others spiral, explain, argue, or prove, they stay still. Because silence creates frame control. Let's break that down. In any social setting, the person who controls the emotional tone controls the room. And nothing shifts emotional tone faster than someone who refuses to react. When everyone expects anger and you give calm, you shift the frame. When everyone expects agreement and you give silence, you force a reset. When everyone expects panic and you give detachment, you expose who's really in control. And that's the ultimate move, to not just stay calm, but to remain undefined. Because here's what silence does best. It keeps you unlabeled, uncategorized, unpredictable. And what can't be labeled becomes feared. Nietzsche believed that modern people suffer because they are too available, too quick to speak, too eager to explain, too willing to expose themselves under the illusion of connection. But connection without boundaries isn't strength. It's self-erasure. And the moment you start withholding your time, your presence, your responses, people start seeing you differently. Not as mysterious for the sake of it, but as valuable. Because value is rooted in scarcity. And silence is the loudest scarcity signal you can send. It tells people, I am not here for performance. I am not here to win your approval. I am here by choice, and I can leave just as easily. That's the frame most people never reach, because it requires not just emotional control, but emotional detachment. And that's where Nietzsche goes further than most. He believed that if you can't detach from your ego, you'll always be controlled by your environment, because the ego wants to speak. It wants to be right. It wants to defend itself. It wants to be seen. But the deeper self, the one Nietzsche cared about, is the self that can sit in its own presence without the need for performance. And when you become that person, you change the outcome of every situation you walk into, because you're no longer participating in the emotional economy of the world. You're no longer bartering with your energy. You're no longer giving people the satisfaction of knowing where you stand until it's too late to stop you. That's the ultimate form of silent winning. Because by the time they figure you out, you've already moved on. You've already won the negotiation. You've already taken the opportunity. You've already redirected the conversation without saying a word. You didn't speak. You didn't react. You didn't defend. You just let silence create the tension, and then let their imagination do the rest. That's how the smartest people win. Not with noise, not with proof, not with perfection, but with absolute self-command in a world that has none. The smartest people win without saying anything, not because they're passive, but because they're precise. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this with terrifying clarity. To him, silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't absence. It was a form of warfare. Because when you no longer speak to be understood, you force the world to respond to your presence instead of your explanations. And that's what true power looks like. The world is full of noise, people arguing over who's right, people begging to be heard, people explaining themselves to death, hoping someone will finally get it. But the smartest people, they move differently. They don't need the win in conversation. They don't need to be praised for their insight. They don't need to correct someone's opinion. Because they've realized something most never do. When you stay silent long enough, people expose themselves. That's why the quiet ones win. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they know exactly what not to say. Think about it. In negotiations, the person who speaks first often loses. In conflict, the person who reacts first usually loses control. In relationships, the person who explains too much often loses respect. In leadership, the person who speaks the least is often listened to the most. Why? Because silence is not absence. Silence is pressure. And pressure makes people reveal who they are. That's the advantage Nietzsche wrote about, even if he didn't spell it out in modern terms. He believed that real strength wasn't in noise, but in formless control. That the man who can remain still while others spiral wins everything without asking. Because here's the truth. People fear what they cannot read. They fear unpredictability. They fear the quiet person who doesn't react. They fear the one who says nothing, because that means he knows something. And the more silent you are, the more people project onto you. Some will assume you're powerful. Some will assume you're dangerous. Some will assume you're wise. Some will assume you're cruel. None of it matters. What matters is that you didn't give them anything real to hold on to. And when people can't define you, they can't control you. That's the final form of quiet power. You become unreadable. And in being unreadable, you become unstoppable. Nietzsche once said, "Invisible threads are the strongest ties." He wasn't talking about friendships. He was talking about influence. Because the strongest influence is the one people don't see happening. The smartest people don't need recognition. They don't need to dominate the spotlight. They don't even need to defend their name. They influence by creating gravity. An unspoken presence. A tension that says, I see everything, but I owe you nothing. And when you carry that energy, you never have to prove who you are, because people feel it before you ever speak. That's not arrogance. That's discipline. That's self-ownership. That's silent psychological dominance. And it's what Nietzsche admired above all. He saw most people as needing to speak, needing to be liked, needing to be validated. But he believed that true individuality, the kind that separates you from the herd, only begins when you become indifferent to all of it. Not numb, not bitter, just above it. Because here's what happens when you master silence. You become harder to provoke, harder to offend, harder to decode. People have no access to your inner world, and what they can't access, they start to respect, or fear, or desire, or follow. That's influence, not manipulation, not dominance, not control through force. Control through space, control through absence, control through the silence they can't ignore. Because in a room full of loud people, the one who says nothing commands all the attention, not through charisma, but through stillness, not through persuasion, but through presence. That's what Nietzsche meant when he said, "It is not the strength, but the duration of great sentiments that makes great men." Meaning, your loudest moves aren't your most important ones. It's the consistency of your silence, your self-control, and your restraint that makes you a force. Because real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It arrives, sits down, and watches. And that's the lesson. You don't need to say anything. You just need to become so whole within yourself that your silence becomes the loudest thing in the room. That's what the smartest people do. They watch, they wait, they absorb. And when the time comes, they act. Not with noise, not with ego, but with precision. And by the time you realize what happened, it's already too late. They've won. Quietly. Permanently. And you never even saw it coming.